All right, welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. Today, we're going to be exploring the John McCabe murder case, a story that takes us all the way back to 1969, time of, moon landings in Woodstock. But in a small town of Tewksbury, Massachusetts, a very different story was unfolding, one that would haunt the community for decades. So our source material for this deep dive is a true crime podcast episode that really digs into this case, and you guys are in for a real roller coaster of emotions right alongside the McCabe family as we uncover all the twists and turns of this 40-plus-year-old cold case.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting how the podcast juxtaposes, those big, iconic moments of 1969, the moon landing, Woodstock, with this very personal tragedy. It really does set the stage for this tale that feels both rooted in a very specific time and place, and yet also kind of, unfortunately, timeless in its themes of loss and the search for justice.
Yeah, for sure. So let's set the scene. It's 1969, and John McCabe is your average 15-year-old boy. And we hear from his sisters in the podcast, and they paint this picture of him as this really mischievous and energetic kid who's always out there tinkering, always getting his hands dirty. They even talk about how he kept grasshoppers in his closet and once even brought home a Canadian goose.
Oh, wow.
I know, it's pretty wild.
Those details are so important, though, because they take John from just being a name on a police report to, like, a real person that we can imagine.
Right.
Like a boy with a love for nature, maybe a little bit of a troublemaker, but full of life. And it makes the tragedy even more poignant,
Absolutely. And then on September 26, 1969, everything changes. John gives permission from his mom to go to a dance. At the Knights of Columbus Hall, he gets all dressed up, heads out, and then he never comes home. And the podcast really captures, the growing anxiety of the family. As the hours tick by, there's even this gut-wrenching moment where we hear about John's mother listening through the bathroom vent as the police are telling her husband the news that John is dead.
Yeah, it's such a raw moment. It just shows, like, the helplessness of the family and the sudden intrusion of violence into their lives. And as listeners, we're right there with them, like starting to feel that knot of dread and wondering what could have possibly happened.
Totally. So the initial investigation is, the flurry of activity. Police find rope and tape at the crime scene, which indicates a possible struggle, maybe even a forced abduction. And pretty quickly, two teenagers, Mike Ferrer and Walter Shell, become the focus of the investigation. A witness places Shell's maroon Chevy Impala near the crime scene. And while Shell fails multiple polygraph tests, the police just can't seem to find that one piece of concrete evidence. That would seal the deal. But before we get further into the investigation, I have to ask, what do you make of this reliance on polygraphs back then? They seem so unreliable.
Yeah, that's a really great question. And you're right. Polygraphs are very controversial. They're supposed to measure physiological responses, like heart rate and blood pressure, to determine if someone is lying. But there are so many factors that can influence those responses, like nerves, anxiety, even medical conditions. So polygraph results are very rarely admissible in court because their accuracy is just so debatable. But back in 1969, they were considered a more valuable tool than they are today.
Interesting. So it's almost the year 2000. That's right. Decades have passed.
Yeah.
With very little progress in the case. But then John's childhood friend, Jack Ward, comes forward with what seems like a bombshell. He tells police that years ago. At a cookout, Ferrer confessed to him, claiming that Shell was actually responsible for John's death, and that it's all because of jealousy over this girl named Mara Shiner. It makes you wonder, what took him so long to come forward. And you can't help but feel for John's father, Bill. The podcast mentions that he kept notes about this conversation with Ward, tucked away in his Bible all those years. Talk about a father's dedication to finding justice for his son.
Absolutely. It's a testament to the enduring power of grief and just the refusal to let go of hope. Imagine carrying that burden for decades, never giving up on the possibility of answers. And when this new information finally comes to light, it's like a beacon of hope, even if it comes after so much time has passed.
Yeah.
It's a major turning point in the case. But things aren't as straightforward as they seem. When the police finally question Ferrer, he denies ever confessing to Ward at the cookout. And just when you think it's another dead end, another name gets thrown into the mix. Edward Allen Grown. He's suddenly identified as someone who was with Shell and Ferrer that night, like 40 years later, and we have a whole new character entering the story.
It's a classic cold case development, isn't it? Like memories fade, new information surfaces, and suddenly the narrative just shifts. The listener's probably thinking, wait, who is this guy? And why are we just hearing about him now? And it just injects a whole new level of intrigue into the investigation, for sure. And this new lead is about to crack the case wide open when Detective Linda Coughlin tracks down Brown. He agrees to a polygraph test. And that's when everything changes. He cracks under the pressure and confesses to being present during John's murder. It even comes out that Brown's own wife had suspicions about his involvement all those years ago.
Yeah, that detail is chilling. The idea that someone so close to Brown might have carried that knowledge for so long, it makes you question what went on behind closed doors and why she never came forward before. It adds like another layer of mystery to the story.
Absolutely. So Brown's confession is huge, and it finally leads to Mike Ferrer being put on trial for John McCabe's murder. During the trial, Brown takes the stand and delivers this very graphic testimony. He talks about picking John up while he was hitchhiking, a plan to teach him a lesson, the struggle that ensued. And this horrifying moment, when they realized that John wasn't breathing.
It's incredibly detailed, and it pulls the listener right into the heart of what allegedly happened that night. But here's the thing. Brown's testimony is also riddled with inconsistencies, and that's going to play a crucial role in the outcome of this trial. And this is where the case takes this crazy turn that I bet you didn't see coming. Despite Brown's confession and this graphic testimony, the jury finds Mike Ferrer not guilty. Can you believe it?
I was on the edge of my seat listening to this part. Like, you think they finally got the guy, and then boom, not guilty. How is that even possible?
Well, the defense team did a really good job of poking holes in Brown's story. They painted him as unreliable, pointing out all those inconsistencies in his testimony. Remember how he kept changing his story about what happened that night? They argued that he was a troubled individual, easily influenced, and that maybe he was trying to protect himself or shift the blame. The defense also emphasized the lack of physical evidence. Remember back in '69, investigators didn't find any signs of a struggle at the scene.
What?
Which cast doubt on Brown's account of a fight.
And they didn't stop there, right? The podcast also mentions how they brought up other potential suspects, like Richard Santos, who had committed a similar crime years later. And then this local guy named Robert Morey, who apparently had some mental health issues, and his own brothers had even implicated him in John's death.
Exactly. So by introducing those alternate suspects, the defense was able to kind of plant that seed of doubt in the jurors' minds. They were essentially saying, look, there are other possibilities here. Don't just assume that Ferrer is guilty based on Brown's word alone. And remember the whole motive of jealousy over Mara Shiner. Well, Mara herself testified, and her account actually contradicted Brown's version of her relationship with Shelley at the time.
So basically the defense just threw everything they could at the wall, hoping something would stick.
Yeah.
And it worked.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. They created enough reasonable doubt to convince the jury that Ferrer might not be the one responsible for John's death.
What exactly does reasonable doubt mean in a legal context?
Oh, that's a really important point, and the podcast kind of glossed over it. So in the American justice system, a person is presumed innocent until proven guilty, beyond a reasonable doubt. So it's not about proving with 100% certainty that they committed the crime. It's about presenting enough evidence to convince the jury that it's highly probable they did it, so much so that any other explanation seems unreasonable. And in Ferrer's case, the defense successfully raised enough doubt to prevent that from happening.
Wow. That's really fascinating. It makes you realize how much power a jury has in these cases. Their interpretation of the evidence, their perception of the witnesses, it all plays a huge role. And in this case, it led to a man walking free, despite a confession from someone who claimed to be there.
Exactly. And for the McCabe family, that must have been absolutely devastating. Imagine fighting for justice for your son for over 4 decades, only to see the man accused of his murder walk out of the courtroom a free man. It's just heartbreaking, especially for Bill, John's father, who tragically passed away just days after the verdict.
Yeah, the podcast really emphasizes the emotional toll this whole ordeal took on the McCabe family. Bill never got to see anyone held accountable for his son's death, but his wife, Evelyn, refused to give up. She was determined to keep fighting for justice. And so the story continues.
And that leads us to the trial of Walter Shell. Same crime, same evidence, same witnesses, even Edward Allen Brown, with all his inconsistencies, takes the stand again. But this time, the jury reaches a very different verdict.
This is the part that had me scratching my head. It's mind-boggling how 2 juries, presented with essentially the same information, could come to such opposite conclusions. One says not guilty, the other says guilty of first-degree murder.
It really highlights the complexities of the justice system and how much influence a jury can have on the outcome of a trial. You have to wonder what was different about those 2 juries. Were they swayed by different pieces of evidence? Did they find Brown more believable in Shell's trial? Or maybe it was something as subtle as the way the lawyers presented their arguments or the demeanor of the witnesses. It's impossible to know for sure.
Yeah, it's a reminder that justice isn't always a simple equation. It's messy, it's subjective, and sometimes it leaves you with more questions than answers. We have two men linked to the same crime, both tried based on the same evidence, yet one walks free, while the other is sentenced to life in prison.
It's a perplexing outcome, and I think it raises some really fascinating questions about the nature of truth and memory, especially in a cold case like this. Can we ever truly know what happened decades ago, when memories have faded, witnesses may have biases, and physical evidence is limited? The McCabe case really forces us to confront those uncertainties head on.
It really does. It makes you think about, like, the weight on the jury's shoulders. They hold the power to decide someone's fate. And in this case, two different juries reached opposite conclusions based on the same evidence.
Yeah, it's a reminder that the justice system isn't this infallible machine. It's a human system, and it's subject to all the complexities and imperfections that come with human judgment. And the McCabe case, I think, really exposes those imperfections in a powerful way.
So if you were on those juries, what verdict would you have reached? It's a tough question.
It's a really tough question. This case is like a masterclass in ambiguity. It challenges our assumptions about truth, justice, and memory. And it reminds us that sometimes, even after decades of searching, the complete truth may remain just out of reach.
Yeah, and even with Shell's conviction,
Yeah.
there's still this sense of incompleteness, right? Like Evelyn McCabe might have finally seen one of the men implicated in her son's death go to prison. But those lingering questions remain, like what truly happened that night back in 1969? Was justice truly served? These are questions that may never have definitive answers.
Yeah, that's the haunting reality. With so many cold cases, they leave us wrestling with this uncertainty, grappling with the weight of unanswered questions. But I think the McCabe case also illustrates the power of perseverance, like the importance of never giving up on the pursuit of truth, no matter how long or how complicated the path may be.
We've gone through a lot today, a real roller coaster ride through this cold case. We've explored the twists and turns of this investigation, the conflicting narratives, the flawed memories, the legal battles, and all along the way we've seen the strength of a mother's love for her son and her determination to seek justice.
And I think maybe the biggest takeaway for the listeners out there is this: when you're faced with really complex and ambiguous situations, don't shy away from those difficult questions. Embrace the uncertainty, examine the evidence, and try to form your own conclusions, because the search for truth, even in a cold case like this, is a journey worth taking.
Well, that's our deep dive into the John McCabe murder case, a story that reminds us that the pursuit of justice is rarely easy or straightforward. It's a story that stays with you long after you've heard it, prompting reflection and reminding us that some questions might never have clear-cut answers. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.